They're here.
Welcome back to Retraced Echoes. As always, I'm your host. My name is Bert. It was the winter of 1958 in Seaford, Long Island, New York. James Herman, his wife Lucille, and their two children, Jimmy Jr. and Lucy, all lived the typical suburban life. But that very peaceful existence was shattered by a series of unexplained and terrifying events that would later be known as the Seaford Poltergeist. Now, that would later become the inspiration behind the 1982 supernatural horror film, the one that I absolutely adore and love, called Poltergeist. I want to introduce something new to our weekly routine. Now, as everyone knows, we talk about things that go bump in the night. Also, when I'm telling these stories, listen, it's late at night when I'm doing them. I can get a little bit tired, so sometimes I feel like I need that little bit of a pick-me-up. So, I thought, what could I combine with our podcast to kind of give me that little oomph, that little extra something? So, every single week I'm going to try out a different energy drink to try to, if anything, pep up these late night tales. So, I thought, what better energy drink to start out with, one that I've never had before? It's an energy drink called Ghost Energy Drinks. Now, I said, what flavor should I start with? Well, what better? I mean, think about it. Summertime is right around the corner here in 2024. It's just a few days away. By the time this podcast release, we're basically going to be in summertime. I thought, what better flavor to start with than the good old orange and cream? Now that is an all-time summertime favorite treat. So let's get started and see what we think. I think I'm going to do a scaling system here. Okay. Ooh. Listen to that sound, boys and girls. Oh, that sounds good. That sounds so good. Don't mind if I do. Man. Ghost energy drinks are known for their vibrant flavors and no-nonsense ingredients. Now, I would say the orange and cream flavor is kind of like a throwback to the old classic creamsicles that we loved as kids. What I tasted was smooth, creamy, and with a perfect hint of citrus. Now, Ghost is a company that prides itself on transparency and high-quality ingredients, making sure that you know exactly what you're putting into your body. But now we got to rate it. We're going to go to the good old bump in the night meter. Now, this is going to be a scale of 1 to 10 ghosts, with 1 being barely a wisp to 10 being a full-on apparition. Now, before I rate it, I mean, it's only fair that I have maybe just one more little sip. One more little sippy sip, Oh, yeah. I'm going to give that a solid 8 bumps in the night. It's got the nostalgic flavor punch, and it keeps me energized for our spooky storytelling. Ooh, spooky. All right, Sarah. While I enjoy maybe just a few more little sips of this summertime memory, can you give everyone the lowdown on what makes, if anything, this haunting a little bit more interesting?
For sure. Before we dive into today's eerie tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and follow us on our social media channels for exclusive content and updates. You can find us on all your favorite social media sites, from Instagram to TikTok, all the way over to Facebook. Also, if you're listening outside of YouTube, be sure to check us out over there for a video version of today's episode. Lastly, be sure to send us your story if you have a haunting that you want us to cover on the podcast. And you can do that from our website over at www.retracedechoes.com.
In a modest green ranch-style home with white trim located at 1648 Redwood Path lived the Herman family. Now, the family consisted of the father, 42-year-old James Herman. Now, he was a decorated World War II veteran. He was a very tall, athletic man who was known for problem solving. Now, he worked as an airline representative for Air France in Manhattan. His wife, 38-year-old Lucille, now she was the head nurse at St. Luke's Hospital and described as a quiet, practical, and very intelligent woman. They had 2 children, 13-year-old Lucy and 12-year-old James Jr., who just seemed like your everyday typical kids. Now, Lucy was the eldest. She was a little bit adventurous and a carefree teenager. Now, James was a little bit different. He was an honor student at Seaford Junior High, and he loved playing chess and collecting stamps. Now, he also had a passion for reciting facts about airplanes and railroads. On the surface, they were just an average suburban family living a very peaceful life. But as the cold winter nights set in, an ominous presence began to stir within their home. Little did they know, their tranquil lives were about to be shattered by a series of terrifying and unexplainable events that would haunt them forever. Sarah, can you tell us what made these hauntings so interesting?
This haunting stands out because of the sheer volume of documented accounts and the involvement of various authorities and experts, much like last week's episode of the Bridgeport Poltergeist. Those involved in this haunting include the local police and renowned parapsychologist Dr. J.B. Rhine. What makes it even more compelling is the fact that these events took place in a typical suburban home. This wasn't an old, creaky mansion. Also, like last week, the family's experience was so intense that it drew national attention.
That's exactly why I chose this episode. If you didn't watch last week's episode or listen to it wherever you're listening to your podcast, it was the Bridgeport haunting. You're going to want to go back and check it out. There was a lot of things that's similar between the two. Now, I didn't know a ton about this episode. When I did research on it, I was kind of shocked with how many things was as similar as what they were. Honestly, when I was looking into this one, I knew last week's episode was a poltergeist episode. I wanted this week's to be a poltergeist episode because a lot of times when I look at these different hauntings, I look at what's the same, what's different. Another one, which is a great poltergeist episode, is the infield poltergeist. Now, I did that on the other podcast, Deceptive Reality. I might end up doing that on this podcast also. I feel like there's a lot of things that's very similar between the three after doing obvious research on this one, but let's stop talking about last week. Let's talk about this week. Let's go. It was a typical Monday afternoon on February 3rd of 1958 when the very first signs that something sinister was about to manifest inside the Herman household. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon when James Jr. and Lucy returned home from school. Now, they was completely unaware that their lives was about to take a very terrifying turn. Now, as soon as James Jr. entered his room, he discovered something very bizarre. A ceramic doll and a model boat, both which was souvenirs that his father had brought back from Venice, laid shattered on the dresser. Now, it absolutely looked like the doll had been hurled directly at the boat, which reduced them both to just fragments. Now, James Jr., he was puzzled, but he basically dismissed it as just a freak accident. He thought maybe it was up on that top shelf and it had fallen down into the boat, which caused this accident. Then an unsettling sequence of events began. The kids heard a pop, followed by something falling over, followed by the unmistakable sounds of water dripping. Now, Lucy knew that what she heard was definitely in her room. She didn't know what it was, so she started looking around. What did she find? A small vial of holy water that was on her dresser. Its cap had been removed, and the contents was spilling all over. For the next 45 minutes, the eerie popping noises continue as bottles throughout the house unexplainably blew their lids. Twist-off caps and corks shot straight towards the ceiling. Their liquids spilling everywhere. Nail polish remover, peroxide, rubbing alcohol, liquid starch, bleach, and probably the most scary of all, holy water. They all erupted from their containers in 6 different bottles across 4 different rooms. Now, Miss Herman, drawn by the commotion, walked through the house with her children. She was witnessing the chaos of bottle after bottle that was popping its top. She was pretty scared, disturbed. She called her husband at work, explained everything that was going on with these bottles, but James, ever the skeptic, he dismissed her story. He just couldn't believe such a strange phenomena could happen inside of his home. Now, right after Lucille's unsettling phone call to her husband, a half-gallon of bleach, which had been sitting securely up on top of the shelf that was inside of a cardboard box, suddenly smashed to the floor just mere feet from where she, as well as James Jr., had stood. The crashing sound had echoed through the entire house. It was a chilling reminder that something was amiss. Now that evening, James Sr. arrived home at about 7 o'clock at night. He meticulously examined the house, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. So what does he do to try to rationalize it? He thinks that maybe the bottles, maybe they exploded due to atmospheric activity or possibly a sudden change in temperature. Reluctantly, they cleaned up the mess and they went to bed, hoping for a peaceful night. Now, for a few days, everything seemed to calm down. But on Thursday, February 6th at about 3:30, the popping bottles returned. Now, once again, the bottles throughout the entire house began to fall and to shatter. The next day, it happened again at exactly 3:30. Unfortunately, Lucille and the children, they were the only witnesses. James Sr., he remained a skeptic. That was until Saturday. That's when he finally saw the phenomena with his own eyes. Now, on that Saturday, bottles of starch, medicines, wines, ammonia, shampoo, antacid medicine, paint thinner, perfume, and ink all unexplainably popped open. At about 10:30, James, he kind of stood in the hallway. He's very suspiciously observing his son, James Jr., thinking that maybe he was behind all these bizarre events. Now, James would later tell the police, he would say, at about 10:30 a.m., I'm standing in the doorway of the bathroom. Suddenly, 2 bottles placed on top of the vanity table began to move. One, it moved straight ahead slowly, while the second spun to the right at a 45-degree angle. The first bottle fell into the sink and the second crashed to the floor. Both bottles had been unscrewed while in the cabinet underneath the sink and had been placed on the vanity top while the cabinet was being cleaned. Panicked by what he witnessed, James Sr. called the police. On February 9th, Lucille also called the police. Now, Patrolman J. Hughes arrived and inspected the house, including the bathroom. Now, while the family gathered in the living room to kind of explain the situation, they heard a strange noise down the hall. As they went to go investigate, guess what they found? Another bottle, uncapped and on its side. Now, in Hughes' report, he said he just inspected the bathroom just before that and that everything seemed to be in place. Now, he did admit it was possible that after his inspection, someone could have put that bottle there. But with that said, he couldn't account for the noise that they all heard together. That case very quickly escalated from a miscellaneous investigation to what's known as a DD priority case. Now, that's where they assigned it to the good old detective division. On February the 11th, Detective Joseph Tazzy was assigned to the case full-time. Now, he was known for his diligence as well as his attention to detail, and he was all about a very thorough investigation. He began by interviewing everyone that was inside the house. He was notating the direction of the moving bottles and even looking into nearby transmitters as well as radio operators. By February the 13th, the disturbances was absolutely unbelievable. They had drastically intensified. Everything from porcelain and plastic figurines being moved around the room. Sometimes they would collide into each other, being thrown across the room and occasionally smashed into pieces. The vials of the holy water, they continued to pop and they were spilling all over the place. Now, Detective Tazzy, he was making meticulous notes about everything that was going on inside the household. On February the 15th, Detective Tazzy, he noticed something that was very odd. He had picked up a bottle that had just fallen over and he noticed that it was very warm to the touch. Now, this pattern, it repeated itself. Objects that would oftentimes fall over when someone would grab them, they would also be warm to the touch, and some even claimed that these items were just too hot to handle. Now, as word of the very strange things was happening, of course, as always, extended family, they wanted to make a little visit to the house. Now, they came to support the Hermans, but obviously, curiosity, it played a role. They wanted to witness the phenomena for themselves. Now, one of the stories that came from the family that was visiting was that there was an untouched glass bowl that was sitting up on top of a telephone bench. Now, that levitated and then fell down to the floor. But probably the best story that came out of that same day was when James Jr. and Lucy's cousin, Mary, they were all sitting on the floor. They was watching television while the family was obviously catching up. all of a sudden, the television, it began to flash and flicker. Now, where does that sound familiar? On top of the flashing and the flickering, there was a strange noise that was coming from it. Now, as they stared in disbelief, a porcelain figure began to raise and wiggle on its own. It then flew 2 foot towards the television, landing with a thud just inches from the screen. Now, the noise was so loud that Mary, she was shocked that it did not shatter on impact. Now, obviously, when word got back to the detective, he was super curious. So Detective Tazzy would later question Mary. If anything, he suspected that maybe the children was behind the disturbances, but Mary? She insisted that none of them was even close to touching the figurine. The events, they happened right in plain sight, defying all logical explanation, which deepened the mystery surrounding the household. By February the 17th, the disturbances were pretty much horrific. The family didn't know what else to do. They had brought in the police. All the police was doing was making reports. They was talking about the disturbances. They could see the disturbances. In some occasions, they were just trying to get to the bottom of it, so they were blaming the family, especially James Jr. They didn't know what else to do, so they reached out to their local church. In fact, they reached out to a local priest named Father William McLeod. Now, he was from the St. William and Abbot Church in New Jersey. Now, the Hermans, obviously, we keep talking about these vials of holy water. They were devout Catholics who attended church every single Sunday. But they had been so disturbed by all of these things that was happening inside their house, they'd even missed a few services. Father McLeod, he was concerned for the family's well-being. He figured the best thing to do was to go over to the house and give it a blessing. So, he would move from room to room, sprinkling holy water while reciting prayers. He was hoping to, if anything, cleanse the house of any kind of malevolent force. Now, despite the father's efforts, the sinister activity, it continued. He later sought permission from the bishop to perform an actual exorcism on the house, but that request, it was denied. The refusal left the family vulnerable, and it kept the haunting continuing. Now, as word of the haunting spread, the local community, they buzzed with fear as well as speculation. Now, let's think about this for just a little bit. You have a house that you've lived in for a while. It's a suburban home. It's not like it's a house in the middle of nowhere. Everything's going fine, and all of a sudden, things start to go a little bit haywire, a little bit crazy. You're skeptics. You don't necessarily believe in the paranormal or anything that could possibly cause these things to occur. You see this kind of thing in the movies. You reach out to the police. The police can't help you. Then you reach out to the church. Luckily, you've got the father that comes out to try to bless the house. Then he tries to get additional help from the church, and the church is like, nope, sorry, can't help with that. You have people around the community at that point in time that believe that this suburban home was almost like a portal to the devil himself. They thought that the devil's hands were at work. Now, when we talk about cases like this, it's always interesting to think about it, but I think for this story and me, it was the police reports that provided a very fascinating glimpse into this unfolding mystery. Now, I can only assume that the police is probably, they're frustrated. They don't know how to resolve it. They're eager to get it resolved, but how do you resolve something that you can't see? They're seeing the bizarre events. If anything, they're thinking to themselves, we can't do anything with this, and we have more important things to do. We have criminals to catch. They're locking down officers at this house on something that they can't even resolve. But the Herman house, it obviously demanded their attention. Now, when I talk about these police reports, I want to give you an example. There was a police report, I think it was at 9:45 in the morning. Now again, Detective Tazzy, he was all about making sure that things was well documented, where things were, what was going on. Miss Herman was with James Jr. and they were in the kitchen. She was on the phone. Inside the bedroom was Lucy and James was putting a book away. Now, this is how descriptive he was. He said that there was a bottle of ink on the south side of the table. In the report, it said there was a loud pop that echoed through the entire room, and the ink bottle screw top, right? Not just sitting on top, it was a screw top. It flew off. The bottle itself then flew in a northeasterly direction, landing in the living room. Now with that, ink spilled across the chair, the floors, all over the wallpaper, all near the front door. Now this had all happened 10 minutes after a journalist had just left. That's why she was on the phone. The journalist was there. They was doing their story, their report. When they left, she got on the phone. When all of this stuff happened, according to the police report, she jumped off the phone with who she was talking to. Then she called the journalist back. Hey, you got to get over here. This is what I was talking about. These are some of the things that we're dealing with. After she gets off the phone, she takes the two children into the hallway to wait for the journalist's arrival. About 5 minutes later, at about 9:50, according to the police reports, there was another noise that echoed from the living room. Now, all three of them rushed in and found that there was a male figurine that had once been on the end of the table that was flying through the air for about 10 feet, crashing into the desk and shattering into a ton of different little pieces. Now, the only sound that was heard was the figurine hitting the desk and breaking into all the fragments. Now, notably, there was only one thing that was plugged into power in that room, and that was an oil burner. There was no one else that was in the room. The Hermans had been standing at the end of the hall near the bathroom. Now, they were apparently, according to the police report, they was all facing each other when the crash occurred. It would have been almost impossible, according to the police report, for them to have caused this, I guess you would call it, event. The family's terrifying story had grown so much that the journalists from Newsday, Time Magazine, the New York Times, and even the London Evening News, they visited the house to try to cover any of these mysterious events. The haunting of the Hermans, it became somewhat sensationalized, at least to some of the agencies. Some of them tried to report exactly what was happening, but then again, how do you sensationalize what they're going through? It's such a crazy thing to hear, but it captivated the attention of both the public as well as the media. And as all of these different places continued to report on all the things that was happening inside the Herman home, and obviously their story continued to spread, the family started receiving letters inside the mail. Now, the envelopes were piling up, and it was everything from advice to recommendations, and these was coming from everyone from citizens to paranormal enthusiasts. Now, most of these letters, they offered suggestions on how to deal with the mysterious disturbances. It'd be kind of like today. The best way I could put it, I don't know how many of you out there in podcast land has ever been on Reddit, but there are different subs that you could go to, like haunting or paranormal, and these people will typically tell, hey, here's what's going inside my house, and you get all kinds of recommendations as far as this is what you should do. But what a lot of people don't think about, you have different cultures, different belief systems, and it's gonna probably, if anything, confuse the family, because there's not one way to handle these kind of situations. There's a multitude. Now, for the family, it was no different than these subreddits and the advice that they give. The remedies was everything from practical to even the bizarre. Now, I think they tried the vast majority of this, all these different things inside the letters, at least within their Catholic belief system. But it never helped. Nothing ever helped. Everything that was happening continued to happen. Now, other letters, they proposed opening, which this is no surprise, the house up to investigations. We talked about something very similar in a podcast not that long ago. where the family also received letters. And once news gets out, different paranormal investigation groups want to come in, and if anything, there's a monetary gain. People from all walks of life, they were eager to uncover the truth about the hauntings. Now, despite the multitude of suggestions and offers for help, the family found no relief. The letters, while well-intentioned, they only served to remind them of the ever-present, unexplainable force that had taken over their lives. As time went on inside the Herman house, things took a much more sinister tone. Objects tied to religion and Americana became very frequent targets. The holy water vials that we've been talking about this entire time, they continued to have the top popped, and they were being spilled all over the place. Colonial figurines, and one of the reports that I saw was a Davy Crockett figurine. It was smashed, absolutely destroyed. The haunting even claimed one of Miss Herman's favorite bird sculptures, which was found absolutely destroyed. Now, on top of all of that, there were strange voices that was reported coming from the television set. That was obviously happening with the flashing and the scrambled images that was happening. As the activity grew more violent, the Herman family, they was forced to move out on 4 separate occasions, seeking refuge with friends and relatives for a total of 6 different nights. Now, investigators, they reported a staggering 67 incidences over the week, with no end in sight. Now, when there's this much attention on a household and a family that has these kind of disturbances, occasionally you're going to catch the attention of a university. In this case, they did with the parapsychology laboratory of Duke University, also known as the Rhine Research Center. Now, they wanted to come in and try to do their investigation. They wanted to send Mr. Pratt and Mr. Roll to investigate, and the family was completely fine with it. They wanted to understand what was going on themselves, and if they've got now a prestigious university, and on top of that, that division of the university, that field of study, why would the family not want them there? So Pratt visited just 2 days after they got the notice that they could come. He was hoping to witness the phenomena firsthand, and within the first half an hour, it did not disappoint. A lamp crashed all the way down to the ground, as well as a plate of bread fell from the table all the way down to the floor. Now, he didn't witness much else on that very first day after that, though after he left, the family said that there were still supernatural disturbances that was occurring. Now, Pratt and Roll, they would return on March the 7th for an extended stay. Now, during that time, they started hearing loud thumps that was coming from James Jr.'s room. Now, that was on March the 9th. A bottle of bleach popped its cap and spilled onto the cellar floor. That was a day later on March the 10th. So they started hearing all these things and seeing all these things. On top of that, they gathered the police reports and the eyewitness statements, and Pratt and Roll, they combined and compiled a detailed 45-page report. Now, that was later published in the Journal of Parapsychology on June of 1958. Now, this report was huge. At 45 pages, they categorized everything. They described the actions and the statements of everyone that was involved. They explored potential physical causes. They even looked at psychological apparitions and even considered the possibility that this was all possibly just a fraud. Yet, despite their thorough investigation, the mystery that was happening inside the house, it remained unsolved. That left the Herman family and the world with more questions than answers. Now, one of the things that I found interesting about the Pratt and Roll report was that they listed potential scientific explanations for all of the disturbances that was happening inside the household, and then they would systematically rule each one out. Let's use, for example, the very first one was high-frequency radio waves. Now, they discovered that a neighbor 4 doors down or 4 houses down from where they lived, he had a ham radio. Now, that would describe some of the strange noises that was happening as far as from the television and even the disturbance. When I was a kid, I remember there was a guy that was not very far down from our house. He had a ham radio, and when he would talk on the ham radio, it would screw up the television signal. That said, when they investigated the neighbor, he admitted that he had not used it for several years, and additional tests even confirmed that no unusual radio waves would have caused that type of disturbance. Now, something else that I found interesting was the police brought their own scientist in also, Dr. Donald Hughes, and he was brought in to test radioactivity. Now, despite the fact that they tested, there was never anything that came from the radioactivity test. There was no radioactivity that was ever detected. I just find it interesting that they even went to that kind of length. And again, it's a different day and age. They didn't know how radioactivity could even affect a house or a family or what they were going through, but still kind of interesting. Now, another theory suggests that maybe all of this was caused by unusual ground movement, like a small earthquake or something like that. So investigators, they brought in some machinery to detect if there was even that. Now, they never found any kind of significant disturbances. As far as the popping bottles, it led them to speculate that maybe someone had tampered with them. So they would send those containers out to police labs to have those tested, see if there's any kind of foreign substances that was inside the bottle. They turned their attention to potential electrical malfunctions. Experts thoroughly examined the house's electrical equipment and appliances. But again, the police came back with the bottles. They found nothing on the inside that would cause it. When it came to the electrical, they couldn't find anything that was out of the ordinary there either. They even considered downdrafts from the chimney as a possible cause. Now, despite installing a chimney turbine cap, the disturbances, they still continued. The very next hypothesis involved air circulation problems. They removed storm windows from the cellar, hoping to see if there would be a change from that, but the eerie activity, it still continued. At this point, they're completely desperate. They don't know what else to do. So, investigators thought that maybe the groundwater levels was causing the house to have these effects. So, they go to the well, they check it. They notice that there was nothing significant that had happened within the last 5 years. They go to maps from the town records to reveal maybe the house was built on a known water source. Again, they came up empty. They even checked the foundation. Now, they found that the building department declared the house structurally sound. The report even stated top to bottom, the house only had normal cracks in the basement from settling. They looked at the beams in the cellar, the concrete in the foundation. They even looked at the rafters in the attic to see if they could find any kind of defect that would cause any of this. The house was very well built. And on top of that, it was in perfect condition. They said they had no other theories that could be causing any of these things. Now, despite the exhaustive efforts to find a logical explanation, the cause of the disturbances, they remained elusive. Now, that left the Herman family and investigators baffled by all of the quote-unquote haunting that was happening inside the house. Now, the reason that they looked at all the foundational stuff is that neighbors were complaining about some of the issues with the windows and that they were cracking during the same time periods. And the biggest reason for that, they thought, was there was an airport not very far from the houses. However, when they looked at the time of the disturbances, which is why everything was time-coded, the police was very good about that. They went to the airport and they found no matching flight times that would have caused those exact disturbances. They had one more theory that would have came from the, we'll call it, physical aspects. They thought maybe it was faulty plumbing lines. So they sent an inspector out to the house, and what they determined was that the plumbing, it was very similar to the neighbors, which experienced no disturbances. So with no reasonable explanation for any of the physical phenomena, investigators, they turned their attention to the only thing that was left, to fraud. Now, Mr. Pratt and Mr. Roll, they both said maybe the Herman children was in on everything. Maybe it was just one of them. Maybe it was them that was going from room to room, that was popping these caps and was breaking these things, was moving things around. Maybe it was one or both of them. Obviously, this theory came under a lot of scrutiny. The biggest reason? There was some third-party people that had witnessed these events also, to which Mr. Pratt and Mr. Roll suggested, well, maybe these witnesses, they were distracted. Maybe they were tricked. I find it amazing that they can rule everything else out. You have a case where these third parties go, there's no way it's the kids. We were there. We saw them. And they go, well, maybe you were tricked. Maybe you were distracted. There were 17 occurrences where the children, they were accounted for. They was nowhere near the event, and the event still occurred. I find it sad that they jumped to that conclusion of everything else and didn't even go paranormal. They just went straight to blaming the kids. With both of the kids, James Jr., he got the worst end of it. He had to defend his innocence through his entire investigation. He was interrogated multiple times by his father. He was interrogated multiple times by the police and even by the researcher Pratt. Despite being grilled to the point of tears, James Jr., he stood firm. He insisted he had no part of the eerie occurrences that had plagued the home. Could you imagine? He was also the child that was all about being honor roll. He seemed to almost have this high intelligence level. Why would he, from my standpoint, why would either of the children be the guilty parties? But in this case, they're grilling Lucy was the oldest. He would have been either 12 or 13 at this point. They're grilling a kid. Now, the possibility of the children being responsible could not account for all of the disturbances. With each new piece of evidence, the mystery deepened, leaving the Herman family trapped in a nightmare of unexplained phenomena with unanswered questions. Poor James Jr. The investigations always seemed to go back to him. They even said that he was so smart, maybe he was using chemistry to blow the tops off of the bottles. Could you imagine this poor kid? He's smart, and they're going, hey, because you're smart, you're probably causing this. In fact, Pratt and Roll, they attempted to replicate using chemicals inside the bottle. And, we all did it when we was in school, right? I think we all used baking soda and vinegar to make something pop or explode or something of that equivalent. I think we all put those substances inside bottles and put a cap in to see what happens. But when they tried to replicate it themselves, the two investigators, typically nothing would happen. Or the bottle would completely explode, which is not what was happening inside the hauntings. It was just the cap that was blowing off. I feel bad for that kid. Now, after they couldn't blame James Jr. anymore, or it was less likely that it was him, the next idea was, what was the family that fabricated the entire story? But that was quickly dismissed. Many disturbances were witnessed by non-family members, including independent journalists that, let's be honest, back then, they was very skeptical of anything that had to do with paranormal. In the very end, out of all the eyewitnesses, the researchers, the investigators involved in the case, no one found any concrete evidence pointing to fraud. There was no strings, no ejector devices, no foreign materials inside the bottles, and no one who witnessed James Jr. or anyone else manipulating objects inside the house. After leaving the house, this blows my mind. After leaving the house, Pratt and Roll, they wrote to the Herman family suggesting that they all take a lie detector test to enhance their credibility. At this point, the Hermans, they declined. They argued they didn't want to subject their kids to any more of the ordeal. Think about it. James Jr. was interrogated by the police and the researchers and his own dad. Despite this, Pratt and Roll, they believed the most plausible explanation for the events that surrounded everything was spontaneous psychokinesis. Now, when you look at psychokinesis, in which we've looked at it multiple times on this channel and even a couple of times on my other podcast, it's said that instead of this being some type of spiritual realm, it's actually a manifestation caused by a person. Now, even though this theory is out there, it's just like anything paranormal, it's never been proven. But it's interesting that they went in that direction. Now, some have speculated that the region's dark history might be the heart of the mysterious disturbances that plague the Herman family. Now, that area was once tied to a great tragedy. It was a massacre of sorts with Native American blood on the land, and it happened roughly 25 miles from Seaford.
The Pavonia Massacre, which occurred roughly 25 miles from Seaford, but extended its shadow closer as tensions escalated. This was one of the first major acts of violence by the Dutch in the Americas. On the night of February 25, 1643, 8 Dutch soldiers crossed the Hudson River from New Amsterdam and stormed the Lenape Native American camps at Pavonia. Over 100 Lenape people, including women and children, were brutally killed. The Lenape eventually retaliated, leading to a cycle of violence and broken peace treaties. Though a peace treaty was eventually established, it fell apart, as so many did. The Dutch soldiers continued to terrorize Lenape villages throughout the region, causing further conflicts. At the Massapequa fort, colonists gathered the dead and dying Native Americans, throwing them in a heap on the brow of a hill. 10 soldiers sat beside the bodies, casually eating breakfast. These were among the last of the Massapequa warriors. The hill they referenced is believed to be in or near Seaford, where the house would be built nearly 300 years later. In the 1930s, bodies were discovered in the area, and these remains were stolen by fortune seekers. The New York Times reported, more than 20 skeletons buried in the fetal position and facing east disappeared. To prevent further looting, the city of Oyster Bay, just north of Seaford, purchased the land and later turned it into a public park in 1958. The same year, the Herrmann family began experiencing strange activities in their home. Could the restless spirits of the past have been trying to communicate? Or was it a residual energy from a time of immense suffering and injustice?
Now that casts, if anything, a thought process that maybe that act of violence that occurred, maybe that has something to do with it. Unfortunately, there was no way to really know what happened inside that house. There was a lot of science that found nothing. There was a lot of religious people that came in that couldn't stop the occurrences. And I think that's why they made such an interesting movie known as Poltergeist that revolves around some of the things that we've talked about today. I guess my question to all of you out there is, what do you believe happened in the Herman house? I'd like to know in the comments down below what you believe. Also, Sarah, can you tell them about the other podcasts and maybe some of the other news that we need to cover before we jump out of this case?
If you're enjoying today's episode of Retraced Echoes, make sure to check out Bert's other podcast, Deceptive Reality. It's your go-to destination for unsolved mysteries and perplexing phenomena. Join Bert and Nick as they dive into chilling tales like the Shag Harbor UFO incident and the Enfield Poltergeist. Also, don't forget to follow both podcasts on all your favorite social medias for updates and exclusive content. Also, make sure you turn in those stories over on our website.
Hopefully you all love this case. I know I absolutely loved it. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. As Sarah said, definitely look into everything that we've got going on. Give us a thumbs up on everything. I appreciate all the support that I get from each and every one of you. Until I see you in the very next podcast, goodbye.